from the Liberals. So, Mr. Duncan, for 5 minutes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's important to understand what we've heard this morning through the testimony. We've now got confirmation, after several rounds of questions, that the NDP were invited and provided briefings with the Liberals in advance of proposed changes to Canada's election laws. And I can clarify, I'm pretty sure Conservatives were not invited to those briefings, or the Bloc Quebecois were not invited to those briefings. Canadians would be very surprised, should be very surprised, stunned at the fact that we have two political parties denied at first to work behind the scenes, and then we found out they were provided information briefings. We're going to find out who was at those meetings when they took place, because it's completely unacceptable now for the NDP to say there's problematic parts of the bill. This proves what we heard this morning, that they were absolutely complicit and aware and agreed to the bill that was proposed, specifically the change of the election date that did nothing more to save and preserve their pensions. The NDP leader is going to get his pension in January or February of 2025. That's why he doesn't want to have an election now. But they complain that now it's problematic. It's only problematic for the NDP now because they got caught this morning. They were fully aware of what was happening. They knew what was in the bill, and it was only the backlash that they got rightfully from Canadians that all of a sudden now that they deem this problematic. The other part that I think is important to learn this morning is the rationale for the date change. And the arguments that were made about, I'm trying to understand what the rationale was. Moving the date had to be moved back a week to October 27th. Couldn't be moved ahead. Had to be moved back to conflict with so it didn't conflict with a cultural event with Diwali, but instead now would conflict with a territorial election. But here's the interesting thing, is that we didn't want to move it ahead to conflict or break with the summer was the line. Yet the Prime Minister had no problem calling an election in the middle of August 2021 when it seemed opportunistic and advantageous for him. So I think this morning we've heard all the reasons, confirmation that the NDP were in on this all along. And secondly, the rationale that the Liberals and the NDP are desperately trying to spin away was exposed. The date was moved not for any cultural event. It was moved for purely political purposes in terms of the pension protection of Liberal and NDP. Look, Conservatives want an election now. I'm not worried about my pension or anybody else's pension. I'm worried about Canadians. And I think what we've seen today, a confirmation, many opportunities for some sort of clarification or rationale, it remains crystal clear. The cynical attempt by the Liberals and NDP to protect their pensions, claim something else, just disintegrated at this committee this morning. That's all I have.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Duncan. Mr. Gerritsen, 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Would you just stop, Eric? Like, honestly. Like, you just so you know, it sounds as ludicrous to everybody else as it does to us on this side. The reality is, Eric, you're the only one sitting at this table that would benefit from it.
Point of order, Chair.
A minute, Mr. Gerritsen.
Just a moment, Mr. Gerritsen. I have two requests, one from Ms. Gill, one from Mr. Deltel. It's probably the same point of order. Ms. Gill, the floor is yours. Thank you. So I'm wondering, I thought that, is this criticizing? Basically, we're here to ask questions of the witnesses, isn't it? So I think other matters can be solved outside of this room. And I would just like us to remain respectful and professional in our interactions. I certainly understand. That said, this is this MP's choice, and he may use his time as he chooses. As I said, I have paused the clock. So, Mr. Berthold, let's hear your point of order. And Mr. Gerritsen, the same point of order, I believe, from you. Mr. Berthold, you have the floor. Mr. Chair, the arrogance, the tone, and especially the fact that he is speaking directly across the table to another MP here. I think that's not acceptable. I think we need to go through the chair, putting questions both to each other and, of course, to the witnesses. So Mr. Gerritsen's behaviour is unacceptable to the committee. We would not want to wind up accusing each other across the room without respecting your authority, all sorts of accusations flying right, left, and center. I think it's up to you to maintain order. And Mr. Gerritsen has certainly overstepped here. Thank you for your comments, Mr. Garrett.
I'll respond. Okay, go ahead.
On the first point, to Madame Gill's point, Mr. Duncan didn't ask a single question of the witnesses in his last round. And to suggest that I am being more personal than he was is just simply false. And second, to Mr. Brotald's point, we don't speak through the chair in this committee. Everybody who's been sitting here has been directing their questions directly at the witnesses and receiving them back. And it is very common in committee meetings to have your time and use your time for your own purpose. So if I want to use my time to be able to be critical of other things I've heard at this table, it is entirely within my right, Mr. Chair.
Okay, colleagues, thank you. Is this on a point of order, Mr. Arnold? Okay, go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to point out Mr. Gerritsen said he was being no more personal than Mr. Duncan. He was. He was directing the attack at Mr. Duncan when he stated that MP Duncan would be the only one in this room to advantage from this. So Mr. Gerritsen was out of line. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Arnold. Okay, colleagues, point of order, Mr. Duncan? Yeah, go ahead.
So just to clarify very clearly, I would like an election now. I'm not worried about my pension. I want an election now, so we can end all of that. And secondly, if it's not a personal attack,
order,
or not talking through witnesses, which witness name is Eric?
Okay, Mr. Duncan, I don't think we're on the point of order anymore. So,
Didn't think so.
Colleagues, there are clearly differences of opinion. Emotions have elevated a little bit in the last couple of minutes. I have heard on both sides of the table a degree of elevation in terms of aggressive tone. I would ask all members to be respectful of our colleagues around the table and to do their best to make their points, however adamantly, in a way that is becoming and expected of us as parliamentarians. So with that, I'm going to return the floor to Mr. Gerritsen for 4 minutes and 30 seconds, which is what was remaining prior to the point of order. And I hope that in the remaining amount of time in his line of questioning, we will be able to do so respectfully. Thank you, colleagues, for your interventions. Mr. Gerritsen, the floor is yours.
And I plan to use my time to make a comment, Mr. Chair. I've been sitting here for an hour watching Conservatives utilize witnesses in this room to advance their own political partisan narrative and for potential gain that they perceive. Don't point at him or anybody on this side. My reference on that was specifically about Mr. Duncan and the way that he's been engaging with the witnesses. Listen, what I can tell you is that Mr. Duncan and Conservatives and perhaps the Bloc are unwilling to accept the reality that a date was chosen based on what the witnesses have told us. Like, I've been sitting here and they said it was based on trying to observe religious holidays and getting as close as possible to the actual date. Like, we all heard the same thing. And then somehow Mr. Duncan interprets that to be something completely different, which is completely false. And so he's just trying to drive the narrative that they've been setting up. And so when the NDP, and I know I don't have to defend the NDP, they can do that on their own. When the NDP decide to say, oh yeah, you know what, maybe the Conservatives have raised a good point. We didn't recognize this, and we agree that it should change. Mr. Duncan's response is, well, you knew all along. Now you're trying to save face. Like, it's absolutely ludicrous and ridiculous. And Eric will sit here and demonstrate this kind of behavior over and over and over to try to illustrate this point. What I can guarantee you of Mr. Duncan is that there's never been a Liberal Party member who has been taken away in shackles and handcuffs for violating the Elections Act. Okay? I do recall a Conservative in that position. So, with all due respect, is today the anniversary of that? Isn't that fascinating? So with all due respect, perhaps you can just tone down the rhetoric a little bit so that we can actually advance an important piece of legislation. If you're against the legislation and you don't believe in it, fine, vote against it. Give us the reasons why you're against it. But not everything is scandalous Eric. Not everything is scandalous, okay? I know conservatives like to try to make absolutely every single issue around here to be some scandal, but that's just not the reality. And I think that your hyped up rhetoric is starting to catch up with you. So please, just tone it down, ask questions about the legislation, and if you don't want to support it, don't support it.
Okay. This is a great time for us to conclude the end of our first round. Est-ce que c'est un appel au règlement, Madame Gill?
Oui, Monsieur
OK,
le Président.
allez-y.
En fait,
Yes, Mr. Chair. I simply wish to check with you. Usually when there's a point of order, the chair renders a decision, not colleagues around the table. Am I right? I have the impression that Mr. Gerritsen provided an opinion on this and not the chair.
Oh, okay. Okay. Excuse me, Madame Gill, c'était probablement...
I'm sorry, Ms. Gill. It may simply have been a misunderstanding and perhaps a matter of interpretation. I do believe that I did respond. Well, I did get an answer, but it wasn't yours. Well, what I stated was that I had not heard anything that, yes, was problematic, at least challenged their procedures here. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.